Good morning, afternoon, and evening from wherever you are joining us today. We welcome you all to our brand new show, Azure Load Testing. This is the second in a seven-part online series hosted by the Bangalore Reactor team. My name is Rashmita, and I am the event planner for Microsoft Reactor India. I'm here today joined by our very own host, Nagarjuna. But before we start the session, I would request you all to read our code of conduct. We are all here to learn together, so please be respectful of other people's views, understanding of differences, being kind and considerate in the way you engage. The chat section is open throughout, and we do encourage you all to participate. Our speaker will answer all your questions during the session. So please feel free to drop all your questions in the chat section. With this, thank you all once again for joining us today. And let me bring in Nagarjuna into the stream to begin the session. Hey, hi Nagarjuna.
Hi Rashmita. Hello everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. I am Nagarjuna. I'm a product manager working with Microsoft, and my area of focus is Azure load testing. So, like Rashmita mentioned, we this is a series of sessions on Azure load testing, leading up to the holiday season, where you may see heavy load on your backend applications or web applications or the different kind of services that you are running, and this series is to help you address those high loads that you see in the season and for you to be prepared with resilient applications. So we bring you a bunch of sessions. Last week we had an overview of session of Azure load testing. Today we are going to talk about JMeter, and then we are going to follow up with again a bunch of sessions, which will also include some chaos experimentation using the Azure Chaos Studio. We are going to talk about different load patterns, how you can test different Azure services, how you can integrate load testing into your CI/CD pipelines. We are going to talk about all of those in this series. So, moving on to the session for today, it's about JMeter. But before we delve into this, let me give you a quick recap of what we discussed last time. Okay, so like I mentioned in the last session, we discussed about Azure load testing. We went through the service, understood the different aspects of it. Before we get into JMeter and you understanding about it, I just want to remind you that Azure load testing is a managed load testing service that is built on top of Apache JMeter, and so our interest in learning about JMeter and helping you write scripts in JMeter. So we discussed that there are two ways in which you can create tests in uh, Azure load testing. One is a quick test where you just give URL and a bunch of inputs and get started. The other is where you can upload a JMeter script and any other artifacts that you may have for the test, like a CSV file and all those, and then you can set a performance criteria for your test using test criteria. You can monitor server side components, and once you are done with that, you can analyze test runs using the dashboard that we have in Azure load testing. You can monitor the server side components and all that to identify performance bottlenecks, go fix them, and make sure that you are ready for the high scale loads. So uh, we this is what at a high level the things that we discussed in the last session. Like I mentioned, this is the managed service built on top of JMeter, and the way you create tests for any of your sophisticated scenarios is by uploading a JMeter script. So let's now dive into understanding a bit more about JMeter. So this is the broad agenda that we have for today. Again, we'll go with the format that we had last time, less of slides and more of showing how to go about it actually by using the tool. So we are going to do a lot of JMeter stuff today. We'll talk about how to install and get started with JMeter. We'll start with creating a very simple test plan with JMeter to get you started, and then we'll also use some of the commonly used JMeter capabilities in addition to a simple test plan. But uh, this is not going to be a session where, I mean, you are not going to be a JMeter expert at the end of this session, but this session is more of giving you an introduction of JMeter. If you haven't played around with JMeter a lot, then you can use this session to get started. And yeah, let's jump right in. So uh, I've been talking about Apache JMeter. Yes, JMeter is an Apache open source software for load testing. It runs on Java. It's a very popular load testing tool in the market. It has been in the market for a long time. It runs on Java, and it is supported on all major platforms, Windows and stuff. And the interesting feature, or the very useful feature of this, is you can extend the functionality of JMeter through plugins. So if you feel that there is something that you are not able to achieve, you can create a plugin of your own and extend this functionality. There is a huge user community out there, people who have tried different things with JMeter and did different customizations for JMeter. So most probably, if you are trying to do a scenario for load testing using JMeter, and if you are not able to achieve it, someone would have already created a plugin for it. If not, you can do it and contribute to the open source. So let me take you to Apache JMeter. So uh, here, this is the homepage of Apache JMeter. You can learn all about JMeter here. This has a very good documentation of all the different things that you can do with JMeter, and you also have download instructions. We'll get to that, but jmeter.apache.org is where you can find everything about JMeter. And yeah, this is the plugins repository, plugin manager, plugins.jmeter.org. You can find the plugins there. There are You can find a bunch of repos and bunch of questions on JMeter in the Stack Overflow community. So yeah, you can search for JMeter and you can find all the questions that are tagged with JMeter. So there is a great community support if you are trying out things with JMeter. And in terms of what kind of endpoints you can test with JMeter, it supports a bunch of different protocols. We've listed some here, but you can find all of those here. Yeah, it can test a bunch of different protocols, and this keeps updating. Typically there are two major releases of JMeter per year. You can find the latest version and the earlier versions as well. If you want some functionality from a previous version, you can get that as well, but mostly the recent versions are backward compatible with the earlier ones. So before we get into the installation, quick note on what JMeter is not. JMeter is not a browser. It will help you load test your endpoints or web applications by sending requests, but it's not a browser. What does that actually mean is, if you have any JavaScript, HTML, or CSS code in your web application, that will not be executed by JMeter. So it starts from the point where you send a request to your backend servers or any of your API endpoints, and then it ends where where the request response is received back on the client side. So if your web applications have heavy HTML or JavaScript executions, the time that is taken to run those and execute those and render those web pages, that is not captured in the response time that you see from JMeter. So moving on to installation and setup, like we discussed, this is based on Java. So you need to have a Java installation, Java 8 or higher on your machine to run JMeter, and then you can go to uh, JMeter website and download the release. Let me go here. So you can go to download releases. The latest is 5.6.2. For today's session, I am going to use 5.5. That is what I've been using for some time now. So I'll continue with that. But you can download 5.6.2, and most of the scenarios that we are trying today should work without any glitches. So if you want earlier ones, you can go to the archives, download releases. Yes, you can go to archives and download earlier versions. So you get to see all the earlier versions here. So you can pick any earlier version and download that. So when we typically say installation, you need to have Java installed, and you need to have some environment variables set up in your machine. But basically, when you download JMeter, what you get is a zip file. So I am showing a zip file that I have here of JMeter version 5.5 that I have here. So you get a zip file, and it has all the different components that you want in here. So uh, here I'm going to the bin, and inside this you will have this jmeter.bat file. I'm trying to zoom in, but yeah, this is the batch file that we run to start JMeter. So what all that you do is you download a zip folder, you unzip it to some local directory, and from there start click on this jmeter.bat and start that start JMeter. So what I usually do is have a shortcut of it so I can quickly get started. So when you double click the batch file, you will see a CLI window opening, and then you will soon see a GUI of JMeter opening up. So we'll get into what are these two and when to use that. But for now, that is how you go about installing the basic JMeter. And then we also talked about uh, JMeter being extensible and plugins. So uh, one thing that you can immediately do after installing JMeter is installing JMeter plugin manager. Using that, you can download all the plugins that are natively available in JMeter, and if you can search and download. So what you can do is uh, okay, yeah, the installation part of it. You have to download this jar file, and in the JMeter installation uh, that you have, you can go to the lib and ext folder, and you just paste the plugin manager's jar file here. So that's what I have done. I have downloaded the jar file and kept it here. So once you do that, in under options, let me zoom in a bit. Yeah. So under options, you see this plugin manager, and when you click that, you get this. So basically, you see what plugins are already installed, and you can search for any other plugins and install those. So this is one thing that you can immediately do after installing JMeter. This is not a mandatory step, but most of the custom, I mean, the plugins that you want with JMeter, you can install using this plugin manager. So you can, as a next step, you can do that. Getting back. Yeah, we talked about GUI mode and CLI mode, right? So to learn about this, let's see the test lifecycle in JMeter. How do you go about authoring and running scripts using JMeter? The first phase is where you create the script and debug it to make sure that it is running. So that is where you use the GUI mode. We'll take a sample. We'll take an example and see how we go about that. But basically, think of the GUI mode is where you create the test script. Once you create that script, it's an XML file, but the recommended way is not that you actually put in the XML code, but you use the JMeter GUI elements to prepare your test plan in a way, and then JMeter will give you the XML for your test plan. So that is how you go about creating or uh, the script and debug part of it. Then you want to make sure that it is actually running. So you do that by putting a moderate or low amount of load, just to make sure that all the requests are being sent in the way that you want them to be sent, and you are getting the response. Your response is as expected. You may want to capture the metrics in some way. You add some elements called listeners for that. We'll get to that, but basically you want to make sure that the requests are being sent in the way you want them to be, and you are getting the response and you are getting the metrics. So till this part is where you use the GUI mode of JMeter, and then now you want to run it at high scale. That is where you want to do load tests. So now you replace the load with high amount of virtual users that you want to run it. And the guidance is that you do not use GUI mode for that. You use the CLI mode. Using JMeter, you have a command in which using which you can run the script that you created. But then even with CLI mode, depending on your memory and CPU of the machine from which you are running, you will be limited on the amount of load that you can run the script with. That is where you can use managed services like Azure load testing to run them at scale. So you create and validate that you create a script, validate that it is actually running fine using your GUI mode, and then you run it is using CLI, or if you want high scale, you come to a managed service like Azure load testing and run it. Once that is done, you get the results and you analyze them. If you are running in your local setup with a moderate load, low to moderate load, then you can use the GUI and different kind of listeners and graphs that are natively present in JMeter to analyze your metrics. Or you can download the results and maybe you use Excel or some dashboarding tool of your choice. Or if you are using Azure load testing, that comes as part of the service. So once you run the test, you see the results dashboard, something that we saw in the last session. So this is how you go about creating, validating, and running and analyzing your scripts in JMeter. Moving on, yeah, I'm more or less done with the slides. Let's get to JMeter and see how we go about creating a test plan. So I'm bringing my JMeter interface back. Let me go. I'll zoom in a bit more. Cool. So this is a test plan that is not saved yet. You can start giving a name. Let's say first test plan. So you can think of the elements in a JMeter script as a hierarchy of elements, and the easy way to go about it, understanding it, is thinking of how what you want to do in a load test. Basically, you have a bunch of users doing some actions on an endpoint. So that's what you start with. You start by adding a thread group or the users. So there are a bunch of different thread groups, some of which are there because I added some plugins. But let's get started with a basic thread group. This is a group of users that are going to do the actions that we are going to specify next. So we are going to start by telling how many users will be doing that action. Now we are in the GUI mode, we are in the script and debug phase. So we'll put low amounts of load. Let's just say we are trying to do with 10 users. And we specify the ramp up time. This is where you define the load pattern. So we talked about this a bit in our last session as well. So we are saying we want 10 concurrent users to perform some actions on an endpoint or a website. So this ramp up time basically specifies the time it takes for JMeter to ramp up from no users to 10 users to the peak load. From start to the peak load, how much time it should take to ramp up. So let's say we give a ramp up time of 3 seconds, and we want these users to keep sending requests infinitely. So we select loop count infinite, and we specify the duration for which this should happen. We are just making sure that our script runs. So let's say we run it for 30 seconds. Now I have specified how many users should do the actions and for how long. Now I actually start specifying the requests that I want. So we do that by adding something called a sampler. So we added the thread group to specify the users, how many of them are going to do the actions. And now we are going to specify the actions. We do that by adding an element called sampler. So there are a bunch of different samplers. Broadly, you can think of them as being connected to some of the protocols, like you have a HTTP request, and then for databases, you have a JDBC request. So let's start with, yeah, we have an FTP one and a bunch of different kind of requests. So let's start with HTTP request. Now, for the purpose, okay, I see a question from Harish asking he missed the last session. Where can I get the link for that? Okay, Harish, we'll post the link to that session. Yeah, Saloni just posted the link to that session. You can refer to that. Okay. Uh, Getting back now, we are adding a HTTP request, and I'm going to use a sample web application for that. So this is a sample web application that I have here. Hmm. Basically, what this web application does is it counts the number of visits to this web page and the time since the last visit in milliseconds. So now, if I refresh, then I again the number of request count it increases. So it's a simple web application, and we are now going to use this to create a load test. So this is a HTTP endpoint. So I come here and enter my protocol. Here it is HTTPS, and I enter the server name or the IP here. So what we should be careful of is not to repeat the protocol here. And we can select the type of request. This is a GET request, so I'm leaving this unchanged. But if it is a POST request or a patch request, I can select that particular request. So yeah, we gave the URL, we specified the protocol, and we specified the type of request. Now we specified the request part of it. Now I want to observe the response and see the response time and all those metrics. So that we can do by adding an element called listener. Basically, these listener elements listen to the response and capture the metrics. So view results tree is one listener which will give you the request and response for each of the requests that this group of virtual users are going to send. You can use this. This is the basic listener that you can configure, and then you can configure. Let's say let's use a summary report. It gives the total number of requests that are sent and what happened and all of that. So yeah, this is a very basic test plan. We are done with creating. What we did was we created a group of virtual users, and we specified what these virtual users are going to do. These virtual users are going to send a request for 30 seconds to this website. Now we can go and save this test plan. I'm going to save this in my sample so I can give let me select the test plan, then the name gets populated. Yeah, So .jmx is the extension with which this file gets saved. It's the extension for JMeter scripts. I'm saving it here. Now just let me open this file and let's see what is the content of it in. Yeah, so when I open it, this is the XML that gets generated. So uh, it is not advised to code this, as in directly put the XML elements into a text file and save the file. That is what JMeter GUI helps for us. So we select different elements and configure those elements. These are then converted into an XML file by JMeter. So all the different inputs that we gave in the GUI, you can see this here. We have the protocol, we have the endpoint, the type of request. These get stored in different XML elements, and this is what we can run and see if it is working or if it is giving any errors. So to do that, we have options here. This is now I'm using the start button to start a test. And now we'll go to this listener and see the request. Yeah, you can see the request being populated here. So for each of these requests that are being sent, you can see what is the actual request that is sent, what is the response data, and if there are any headers, the response headers, all of that you can see here. And in the sampler result, you can see different things like what uh, the latency, the connect time, and what is the response code. All of that you can see here in the sampler result. Now we have added one more listener as well, the summary report. So yeah, we the test run is completed now. In total, there were 878 requests that were sent during this 30-second time interval, and all of them were successful. So there are no errors here. There is a throughput of 29 requests per second. These are the average response time, average min max response time that was observed. So you can view all of this and you can save this data into a CSV file as well, and view that later, or maybe you can take this to some monitoring tool and analyze as well. So this is how we go about creating a test plan and validating it. The next part of it is taking it to a tool like Azure load testing and then running it at scale, wherein we'll specify a number of threads here. The guidance for Azure load testing being 250 in the JMeter plan, and then let's say if you want 1,000 users, you can choose 4 engines in Azure load testing to run the same script on 4 engines so that you simulate a load of 250 virtual users. So that is the next part of the test life cycle that we saw earlier. So now this is a simple test plan. Now maybe I want to see, let's say I have an e-commerce application, I have an web application where there are a bunch of different pages and users navigate across pages. So I want to add multiple HTTP requests. So then you can go add this HTTP request. So the same web application that I used, this has uh, another functionality, as we saw here, that it gets the time since last visit. So there is a API get request which gets the latest timestamp. So that is the last timestamp. So the path for it is HTTPS, the URL of the web app, and this slash last timestamp. So that is my path to the get request that process and gets me the latest timestamp. Now, so now I want to add that as well. I want to basically use two HTTP requests. So to differentiate those two, I can change the name of my request. This is my last timestamp, and maybe this, let me call it homepage. So now again I can save it. This gets updated in the XML script, and now I can run it. So what happens when I run it is, again, the request that I'm generating now will get appended to the request here. So what we can do is we can just clear those, so we get the results of only this test run. So now the group of users are sending requests to both the HTTP elements one after the other. So we can see this here, and again the same thing we can see in the summary report. In summary report now we have this thing for both the requests that we have. The test has completed running, so you see it here, uh, that we are able to again start it. Let me just show you one more thing. So if you have okay, here we have run this test for only 30 seconds, but if you want to try out for long, maybe you have a 1 minute ramp up time, and then you want the load to go up, and you are validating it for, let's say, 5 minutes, and you have started the test, and here in view results tree, you see that all of your requests are failing. So you can stop it and understand what is happening. Let me put in HTTPS here again. Now I'll run this, and when I go to results tree, yeah, my requests are failing here. So I would want to know why these are failing, so I can stop the test and understand. So the request is not being sent. The actual request that is being sent is null. So I can go and figure out what is happening with uh, this request. Last timestamp is working fine, but the other one is not. So I can go here and figure out what's wrong and change it. So you can stop the test and debug it and make sure that the test is running as intended. So now what we have done is we have added another request, and we observed the results in summary report and view results tree. Now let's say I have added some 10 requests like this for 10 different web pages that I have, and now I want to replicate the plan for another environment. Maybe this is my test environment. I'm satisfied with the performance here. I want to now test in pre-prod. So my pre-prod environment may have a different URL. I have to go and change all the URLs here. So instead of that, what we can do is use variables, environment variables. So for that, we can add a config element at the test plan. So we can right click on the test plan, add a config element, which is called the user defined variables. So now I can add variables here. Now let me say web URL is the name I'm giving to the variable, and then I add my URL here. So now I have added a user defined variable, and I'm going to use this variable while I define my request. So the way to use it is using dollar and curly braces. So now instead of this, I'll give the name I gave to the user defined variable. So now in all my requests, I use this web URL, the user defined variable that I just created. And now if I'm going to, if I need to create a test plan for another environment, I'll just come here and change this value and save the test plan with a different name using this save as, and I'm done. I'm ready to run this on another environment. So let's actually try out and see if this is working, or if we did any syntax errors. Yeah, it's working now. The response is 200, and I can see that my request is being sent as I intended to be. The value from my user defined variable is coming here, and the request is getting framed. So in that way we can use this user defined variables. And now let's see how we can use this feature in Azure load testing. So here, if you want to use the same feature in Azure load testing, you can use this parameters tab. So this is a sample test plan that I've already created here. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm giving my web app as my parameter, and I'm giving the value for it, and then I can use it in the test. And when let's say I have a test like that, and if I am trying to rerun that, I see those here in the rerun screen, so I can just change the value of it and run in a different environment. I do not even have to create another script with that. I can just change the URL and point it to another environment, and I can run test on that environment. However, to achieve this, if you are using the JMeter script with Azure load testing, there is a slightly different syntax that you'll have to follow. Okay, instead of searching for the documentation, let me directly go from here. So I'm trying to parameterize my load test using the JMeter interface, and I want to know the syntax. So I just navigate to the documentation using the learn more link there. So here we have to use a bean shell function. Bean shell is basically a way you can write some Java kind of syntax to interact with the JMeter APIs and any APIs or methods from any jar files that you can include to customize JMeter functionality. So Bean shell is the way to interact with it, and this is the syntax for you to use environment variables with Azure load testing. So you use the name of the user defined variable that you created. I created it as web URL or documentation. It's the same thing. The web app is the name of the variable, and then you enclose it in this syntax by using a bean shell function. Now, let's say this is a I mean, the function that we used is web app. There is nothing sensitive about it. It's a URL, but there may be some parameters that I want to pass at runtime, which may be sensitive. Like maybe I want to test an authentication flow, and I want to pass an access token, or I want to use a password, things that are sensitive. So Azure load testing helps you with that, wherein you can configure secrets also along with the environment variables. You can set up secrets and certificates, but since these are sensitive parameters, what you have to do is you have to store these values in Azure Key Vault and give the link to your Key Vault value, I mean your Key Vault here. And again, how to go about that from load testing, we have a get secret function very similar to the get system.getEnv function that we have. This is for environment variables that are not sensitive. If you are using sensitive parameters like secrets, you can use this get secret function and in your JMeter script. So basically, instead of this default JMeter syntax of using dollar and curly braces, you will have to use these two things when you want to get it working with Azure load testing. So yeah, so far we have created a very simple test plan. We started with adding one request, then we added multiple requests, and then uh, we added a user defined variables to parameterize and parameterize the request that we are sending. So next up, we are going to talk about bunch of different things that you can achieve with JMeter. So in the interest of time, going to use some samples that I already have. So next, let us go to using some data that we want to send along with the request. So let's say you want to mimic the user flow of searching for a particular product on your e-commerce website. So you have to give the search term along with the request, right? So your users are going to put in some test I mean some text while searching for different products. So you in the request you want to be sending that data as well. So the way to go about it is again using a config element. So you can use this CSV dataset config. Basically you have to what you can then do is browse for a CSV file that you have, and then choose the delimiter that you have in that. You can give the variable names, and then use these variable names in your requests. So let me open a test plan that I have with CSV element in it. I don't want to save the test plan. So here I have a CSV dataset config. I chose the CSV file and I have two columns in that, name and ID. I give the column names here. Now I can use this column names in my request. So like I was saying, I have a search page, and it is my base URL slash shows. It's a get request. So now in the request, I am passing some parameters, and now I'm going to use these variables from my CSV dataset. So you can add your dataset in the form of a CSV file, add the CSV dataset config element, reference the column names, and then use the column names here in this request. Again, going back to how you use this feature with Azure load testing, in the create flow, while you are creating a load test, you upload different files along with the JMX file. This is where you upload all of your files, the JMX file and the supporting artifacts. You also upload the CSV file. So if you have noticed in the test plan, when I was showing it in the earlier test plan, when I browsed for the CSV file, JMeter usually captures the entire path to your CSV file. But when you are using Azure load testing, we take all the files that you give here in the test plan and upload it to the same directory. So I mean, the relative path for all of this is the same. They are residing in a single directory. So when you are taking your JMeter script with which is using a CSV dataset config and then running it in Azure load testing, what you would have to do is remove the path. So you initially start with pointing it to your CSV file that you have in your local, run this on a moderate load and make sure that this is running. So you know that you reference the variable name correctly and you are using it correctly in your request. You make sure that all of that is working fine. And before you upload this JMX script to Azure load testing, you have to remove all this path and just give the file name of the CSV. So just you give file name .csv and then upload it here. That's how you get CSV files to work with Azure load testing. So that's how you can use CSV files along with Azure load testing. And okay, cool. Now let's talk about properties. So JMeter, you can customize the functionality using plugins, but there are a bunch of different things that we have done here. We have added samplers, we have added listeners, and there are different ways in which different elements in a JMeter script or a JMeter setup works. So you can change the default functionality of different elements in JMeter using something called properties files. So if you go to the your JMeter folder, so in bin you have this bunch of different properties files. uh, Let me show large icons. Yeah, so here we have different properties. Yeah, you can see JMeter dot properties here. So all of the different functionalities of uh, JMeter are here. So by default, these are all commented out, and usually the guidance is you should not change this JMeter dot properties, because once you change it, it'll the change that you are implementing here or trying to enforce here will be applicable for all of the tests scripts that you run with the installation of JMeter that you have. So by default, this is where JMeter will read the properties from. So the guidance is that you should not change anything in this jmeter.properties file here. So there are a bunch of things you can configure: the look and feel, then you can configure the way the results, you can configure some backup configuration. So all of the different things, there are a bunch of different things that you can configure using these properties. Different elements have different properties, and you can control them using these properties files. What you have to instead do is there is a user.properties file here, this one. So whatever, let's say you want to change this number of connection retries, let's say. So you copy this here and move it to your user.properties, and then set the time, set the value for it here. So in the user.properties that I have here, I have set the duration for the test run, and then I can use this property in the JMeter script. But this is how you go about it. One way of going about it. The other way is you create a dot properties file with just the values that you want to change, and then include that dot properties file here. And then at runtime, when you are running JMeter in your in CLI mode, you can use that properties file. There is a syntax, you can find it on the JMeter website. Basically, you can specify it as a parameter saying you read the configuration from this properties file of me. So you can customize a bunch of different properties, but the way to do it is not by changing jmeter.properties, but by using a user.properties or a separate properties file. Now, again, getting back to how do you get this working with Azure load testing, you can upload any properties file here again in your test plan. So I have this test.properties that I can upload, but this can be a file that you are uploading as part of your request as well, or maybe it is part of the artifacts that you want for your test plan. So to specify that this is not any other artifact but a properties file which you are using to customize some JMeter functionality, you can select the file relevance and say that this is a user properties file that you are uploading. So any customizations that you specify in this test properties will then be honored by Azure load testing, and then the relevant functionality will be customized. However, there are a bunch of properties that you cannot customize. You can find these here in JMeter property overrides on the documentation. We override some of these properties to ensure that the service is running. These are the way in which the JMeter setup on the test engines need to be run. So you cannot change these properties, but other than the ones that are listed here, you can change the properties using properties file. Since we just have 10 minutes left, I'll quickly go about uh, talking about extending the functionality. Like I said, you can use the plugins that are already there. If you are using the plugins that are already there in JMeter plugins, you don't have to upload any jar file while you're creating a test in Azure load testing. But if you have a custom function that or a custom plugin that you have written for your case, or if you are using some open source plugin that is out there, you can upload the jar file along with the other artifacts that you have, and along with your JMeter script and whatever custom functions you have, then those will be taken care by Azure load testing. Let me open this. So here we have used a jar file, and then we are using some of those here, like the base URL. Basically, the uh, custom jar file that we have written here is a simple function that looks for a parameter value. If the parameter is not found, it defaults to the default value that is specified. So you can then reference those elements in your JMeter script as well, and get it working. The way to use it in Azure load testing is by uploading that jar file. Okay, let me take a look at what else I wanted to talk about. We talked about, yeah, okay. Uh, Let me quickly talk about something called backend listeners. We added a listener in our test plan, right? So the first test plan that we created, where is that? My first test plan. Where is this? Yes. So here we added these listeners, which are giving us the results here in this JMeter interface. Now, uh, let's say I have a monitoring tool and I want all of these results to be flowing to that monitoring tool. Let's say I want them to be coming to my app insights. So what I can then use is an element called backend listeners. So in the interest of time, I'm quickly showing you a JMX file where I have already added a backend listener. Yeah, you can add this backend listener element. You can say listener and then this backend listener, and you can set it up. So basically, you have to give the implementation of this backend listener, and you have to give the, yeah, connection string to your app insights instance. So here you've, since it is sensitive, I didn't give the actual value. So basically here you have to go, you go to your app insights instance and get the connection string there, and you enter it here. Again, if you are using it with Azure load testing, you can parameterize that. You can put the sensitive value in key vault and reference it here. So basically what this will do is all the results that you are seeing here in that we saw in the view results tree or in the summary report, the different aggregations of response time and all of that, those will be uh, made available in your app insight so that you can build custom analytics on top of it. So you can also customize the aggregations that you want. Let's say if you want a different percentile, let's say you want 97th percentile as your SLA is on that, you can mention that here, and the data will be flowing to your app insights. So you can get more information on how to do that here in the export test results section of the documentation. We also gave a link to the sample JMX file. This is the same sample as that I'm using here. You can download it by following this link, or you can also go to aka.ms slash malt hyphen sample. So malt is Microsoft Azure load testing, and you are looking for samples. So aka.ms slash malt hyphen samples, you will see the code samples that you have, and yeah, you see JMeter backend listeners right there. Along with that, there are a bunch of different scenarios for each of those. You have the JMX file, so you can go and try out those scenarios. Okay, we have 5 minutes. Let me quickly check if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'll cover just one more topic. Okay, I do not see any questions on the chat. So uh, let's end this session by talking about how do you test non-HTTP services, because the more popular or the regularly tested ones are the web apps and HTTP, but there are a bunch of different APIs that are in your backend. There are a bunch of different non-HTTP services that are there, and which will actually impact the performance of the final end application. You can test those as well using uh, JMeter. Let's see a sample of how you go about testing a database with using JMeter. Again, we have step-by-step instructions in one of the blog posts that we have, aka.ms/malt-blogs. So if you want samples, say aka.ms malt-samples. If you want blogs, say aka.ms/malt-blogs. And here you can find a blog post that we have written on load testing databases. So here you have the step-by-step instructions, but I'll quickly show you using the same JMX file that was used in the blog post. Yeah, the SQL DB blog post. So basically what you have to do is you have to download a jar file and include that for MS SQL. And here you have to add the JDBC element. So you have this JDBC connection configuration where you give the URL database, you give the username, password. Since these are sensitive ones, these are parameterized, or they're not visible. But basically, this is where you configure the connection settings for your script, and then you can write the different queries that you want. Here you can parameterize your queries and pass those using a CSV file. So all the different queries that you think will run when some user submits the request, and maybe the queries that you think are highly resource consuming, you can put those in here. Again, you can get all of the different metrics that you want related to these queries. And when you use it with Azure load testing, you can also monitor your database. Let's say you are using Azure SQL. You can monitor the Azure SQL DB using server-side monitoring, and you can see the CPU utilization, memory utilization, and a bunch of different parameters that you want to monitor for SQL database. So I'll conclude my session with that. Like I said, if you want all different scenarios, and you can go to this code samples, or you can go to these blog posts where we also have explained scenarios like you want to first authenticate your user, get an access token, and then use it in your subsequent requests. So you can test an authenticated flow. You can find that here, authentication with load testing. So a bunch of different scenarios are available in this blog series and the code samples, and you can use those to have a structure of a JMX file for your scenario and then tweak it as required. So we just have 1 more minute and I'll close the session here. I do not see. Okay, I see a question. Could you please run the Azure load test once and show the insights? So, okay, I'll quickly, in the interest of time, go to a test run that is already run. I hope it's fine to go over by a minute. Is that fine, Rashmita?
Yes, sure.
Okay, cool. I'll just walk through the metrics. So, when you run a load test using the script that you created, this is how you see the results to be. You see the statistics of how the response time was and error percentage was at an aggregate level. And you also see the client side metrics uh, here, how the virtual users or the load was ramping up, and or it is how it is getting maintained at different points in the test. How is the response time in when the load is going up? How was the response time, and how was it at the peak load? How is the throughput? What are the errors? You can analyze all of those, and you can also add components for monitoring. In this test here, I do not have the components added, but let me okay, you can add that here in this monitoring section. You can add that when you are creating the test itself, then you will see the results directly. But if you have not done that, you can add it after the test has run also. So uh, let me select my resource that I have for this. Yeah, okay. Let's say I have a app service for the podcast demo application and a storage account that is running it, and then there is yeah. Let's for the demo purpose, let's add these two components. So what you basically see is, for the duration of this test run, you also see what's happening on the server side. You get to see how your app service and storage account, in this case we added these two, so we are seeing the server side metrics of these components. You see the availability, CPU, memory utilization, and you can also go and configure the different metrics that you want to see for each of these elements. So for a storage account, you can, if you want to, if you are not interested in availability, you can remove it and add something else that you are interested in. So you can do that as part of setting up the test. Then for each test run, you will automatically see these server side metrics as well. But if you, let's say you forgot to do that, at the end of the test, once it's run also, you can add these and see. But if you do so, then this is to the scope of only this test run. So when you run it again, you again don't see the server side monitoring. What you can do then is you can go and configure the test and add the monitoring. Hope that answers the question. uh, yeah, I do not see any other questions. Rashmita, I think we can close the session with this.
Thank you. Yes, even I don't see any other questions. So, yes, thank you, Nagarjuna, for this amazing session, and thank you all for joining us today. The next session is on 22nd August, same time. Please do join us. Also, please visit our Microsoft Reactor website for more upcoming session. Feel free to use the Learn module link, which I have already shared in the chat section. This will give you access to additional resources. And yeah, thank you all once again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.